Okay, next question.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chomsky. My name is Borek Lacina. I have a serious question. I would like to ask you about your opinion of the crisis in the Ukraine. I think that perhaps there could be a great war coming out of this crisis. I have read an article from a Russian newspaper that it was an interview of a Finnish politician. He was saying that there is an imminent war threatening, an ugly war threatening Europe if the nations of Europe don't change their opinion to the politics of the United States and Russia. I would like to ask you, what would you think about such a conspiracy theory that the United States have a huge debt? What would you think about this theory that they could sell their weapons, export their weapons to their allies in Europe and earn money in that way so that they would support the war here in Europe and earn money in order to pay back their debts? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think the issue is so much profit about weapons, but it's a dangerous situation. Let's go, I think I won't repeat, but go back to the fall of the Soviet Union, USSR, and the decisions that were made right at that time to expand NATO to the east in violation of verbal promises to Gorbachev. That's what, of course, has happened. NATO has moved right to the borders of Russia. The question of Ukraine, which is, goes beyond, say, having Poland be part of NATO or Estonia, because that's really central to, for all kind of reasons, historical, population, popular concerns, strategic interests. It's very central to Russian strategic and national and other concerns. So if Europe and the United States proceed to try to integrate Ukraine into Europe, including European military system, NATO, and remember that NATO is primarily a device for the United States to control Europe. NATO doesn't defend Europe from anyone. NATO keeps Europe under U.S. control. That's why the U.S. has always pushed for it so hard. But if Europe agrees to that, and the U.S. presses for it, that could lead to a military crisis. In fact, right now, it's very interesting to see the way this is described in the press. I don't read the Czech press, of course, so you can tell me, but in the US, British, French press, the way it's described is there's a danger because the Russians are mobilizing forces in Russia, right? In Russia. The Russians are mobilizing forces, and the question is, well, are they near Ukraine or not? And meanwhile, the United States and its NATO allies are mobilizing forces in Poland, in the Baltic states, right on the borders of Russia. But that's not a problem, because remember the principle, we own the world, right? If anyone gets in our way, they're the ones who are causing the problem. So if Russia mobilizes forces in Russia, that's extremely dangerous. In fact, just a couple of days ago, the U.S. Defense Secretary, Chuck Hagel, may have seen it, he conceded that the Russians seem to be withdrawing their forces from the borders of Ukraine, meaning withdraw them further into Russia. But he said that really doesn't handle the problem, because we cannot overlook the fact that they did have forces there. So even if they withdraw them, it's still the same threat. Russia is a threat if it mobilizes forces in its own territory. Nobody talks about any threat if the United States mobilizes forces in Poland. In fact, today's newspaper points out, to reassure the Poles, that the United States is not only keeping forces there, but is establishing what are called missile defense positions there. When you hear the word defense, any reader of Orwell should know that defense means offense, and it does. What's called missile defense is understood on all sides to be a first strike weapon. Missile defense is a first strike weapon. Strategic analysts on all sides agree to that. The West, Russia, China, they all understand it. And the logic is perfectly obvious. Even if missile defense would work, and nobody knows if it would never stop a first strike. The most it could possibly do is stop a retaliatory strike, which means that it's a first strike weapon. You can strike the enemy and maybe defend yourself from retaliation. That's understood all across the board. They call it defense, but it's like calling the Pentagon the Defense Department. It just means War Department. So yes, we're going to reassure the Poles by putting first strike weapons on their territory. That's okay, again, because of the same principle. We own the world, so that's fine. Just imagine, say, that to reverse the situation, that the Warsaw Pact still existed, and it was mobilizing forces in Canada and Mexico, and putting first strike weapons in Mexico and Canada. How would the United States react? That's the question you should be asking yourselves. Well, we don't ask that question because it violates the fundamental principle that we own the world, and everybody else is there by our sufferance, more or less. They got to obey or they're a problem. So could this lead to a major crisis? Yeah, it could. If Europe continues to support U.S. efforts to expand a hostile military alliance to the borders, further to the borders of Russia. It's already on the borders of Russia, has been for a long time. Well, yeah, that could lead to a crisis. However, I think there are other things that are likely to happen. Ukraine potentially is a pretty rich area. In fact, it was until, by East European standards, it was until 1991. Since the market system was imposed by force, pretty much, Ukraine became a complete basket case. It's now an economic disaster. And you look at the IMF proposals to rescue Ukraine, they're going to make it worse, almost certainly. In fact, they pretty much say so. They have to impose a harsh austerity regime, you know what that means, higher unemployment, and what social services there are. There's going to be a tremendous burden in Ukraine. Who's going to pay for it? Well, you are. If Europe succeeds in integrating Ukraine into the European system, somebody's going to have to pay for this, and not so much the Czech Republic as Germany, basically. They're not going to like it. They don't want to bail out other countries. And that may be an impediment to U.S. European efforts to bring Ukraine into their system. But it's a dangerous situation. Incidentally, this is not to change an important fact. We're talking about Ukraine, but there's also Crimea. When the Russians invaded and annexed Crimea, that's a direct violation of international law and also of specific treaties. There's a treaty, I think 1994, in which Russia was a part, which guaranteed the borders of Ukraine. So yes, that's a criminal act. And there's plenty of talk about that in the West. Putin is denounced as a new Hitler, a monster, insane. How could he do something like this? The way John Kerry put it, in this century, it's impossible. Nobody could imagine sending military forces across another country's border. Of course, we sent military forces into Iraq, but remember, Iraq's not another country. It's part of the world, and therefore we own it. So that wasn't aggression, and therefore there was no comment about that. But Putin did carry out a criminal act. And it's kind of, and there are other cases. If you can imagine kind of a thought experiment. Imagine that there was a free press, you know, something like that. What would they be writing? You know, well, you can see what they'd be writing. They could say, yeah, this is a criminal act, one of many, and by no means the most serious one. I mean, the most obvious analog that comes to mind immediately is the U.S. takeover of eastern Cuba in 1903. At the point of a gun, Cuba was under military occupation. The U.S. took over eastern Cuba, which happens to include Cuba's major harbor. We call it Guantanamo. Southeastern Cuba, large part of Cuba, Cuba's major harbor, the outlet to Europe for trade and so on. The U.S. took it over. 1959, Cuba finally became independent, asked for it back. U.S. refuses. They've been asking for it back ever since. U.S. refuses. Cuba is accused of human rights violations. Correctly, there are human rights violations. The worst of the human rights violations by far is in the section of Cuba that the U.S. runs, Guantanamo. That goes way beyond any charges against Cuba. What justification does the U.S. have for holding on to southeastern Cuba? It does have a justification. Namely, that's part of the strategy of undermining Cuba and preventing its development. You read the newspaper this morning, you'll see that the U.S.'s lead story in the New York Times, front page, is about the U.S. imposing sanctions on a big French bank, BNP, imposing charges against BNP. It's going to claims wants to charge them $10 billion for criminal activities. Now, what are the criminal activities? The criminal activities are violating U.S. sanctions against Cuba and against Iran. The U.S., being the ruler of the world, imposes sanctions against other countries, and if other countries don't obey the U.S., they get punished. I mean, why on earth should a French bank observe U.S. sanctions? I mean, the sanctions have no status, other than the fact that the U.S. is the strongest country in the world. Other than that, they have no status. But they can impose them, and part of it is because BNP is alleged to have have dealings with Cuba, and we've got to strangle and destroy Cuba. So we've been trying to do that ever since Kennedy, 50 years. And holding on to southeastern Cuba is a big part of that. That's the total justification for the U.S. taking over southeastern Cuba. Well, Putin did carry out a criminal activity in the case of Ukraine, but it's nothing like this. In the case of Ukraine, there are, plausible justifications. They don't change the illegal character of the act, but there are justifications. It's the only, first of all, the population of Crimea is apparently pretty strongly in favor of it. I mean, even if you question the latest referendum, remember it's about the same as a referendum that was taken, I think, 1991, no Russians, which came out with the same result, about the same result. So there is popular sentiment, there's all sorts of historical reasons, which you know. There's strategic reasons. It's Russia's only warm water port. It's the seat of the Russian Black Sea fleet, Mediterranean fleet. There are plenty of strategic and historical and cultural reasons. There are none in the case of southeastern Cuba. It's a much worse case, and not the only case. So if we had a free press, that's what you'd see in the headlines. Well, of course, you don't see that. Again, because of the same principle. Since we own the world, those questions don't arise. But that's Crimea. Then there's Ukraine, and Ukraine could turn into a significant, serious military crisis. Actually, it's worth, I don't know if there's really no time to go through it here, but I'd really urge you to look through the history of the nuclear crises that took place. Some of them are pretty remarkable, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we have plenty of information about now from impeccable U.S. sources, and it's quite a story. No time to talk about it. But let me just mention the most recent case which has been discovered. We've come very close to nuclear war over and over again. Just a couple of months ago, another case was discovered. And this is an interesting one. It's telling. It bears on this situation. This was in early 1980s when the Reagan administration came into office. You may recall that that was a very tense moment in Europe. Pershing II missiles were being installed in Europe, which had a 5-minute flight time to Moscow. Reagan had announced the so-called Star Wars program. It's called missile defense, but as I mentioned, everybody knows it's a first strike weapon. And there were other tensions arising. At that point, the U.S. was carrying out military operations to test Russian defenses. They were simulating air and naval attacks into Russia, and the U.S. called a high-level nuclear alert, which, of course, is advertised to strategic allies and enemies, so Russia was intended to know about it. And the Russians, turns out, were worried. They didn't, Russia, unlike the United States, is vulnerable, and they didn't know. Well, it was known that this was kind of dangerous, but just recently, Russian archives have been released, which show that it was far more dangerous than was assumed. In fact, the CIA just published a monograph with the title, "The War Scare Was Real." And the conclusion is that we came very close to having a Russian preventive strike, which would have meant the end of Europe and the United States. It wipes everyone out. It turns out it was worse than that. Just a couple of months ago, it was revealed that Russia's automated systems, they have automated detection systems like the United States for incoming missiles. The automated systems sent a message that there was with certainty that there was a U.S. missile strike underway against Russia. Now, the protocol in Russia, like the United States, is that those messages are supposed to be transmitted to the highest military command, and they're supposed to react. The protocol is they're supposed to react with a retaliatory strike immediately. Well, what happened is that a single human being, Stanislav Petrov, who was the officer in charge, decided not to send the message. He broke the orders. So he didn't transmit the message to the Russian high command. It's because of that that we're alive to talk about it, literally. If he had followed protocol, there'd be nothing to talk about. We wouldn't be around, okay? That's how close we came. Was it even reported here? Maybe. If so, good. Wasn't reported in the United States. Who cares? There have been things like that over and over. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us you could, some mistake, accident, could set off a terminal nuclear war. And that's why it's extremely dangerous to play with fire on these issues.
My name is Majid Abu Salama. I'm the founder of the Intifada Youth Coalition in Palestine. I'm very happy that he talks about Gaza and Palestine, which is he continue with his political view, which I wish all of you will have this political view when it comes to human rights and justice. Tomorrow there is an invitation. I will be speaking about Gaza, which he mentioned a bit about it. There will be an invitation outside with the guys. You can come, you're welcome. My last question is labels. When it comes to labels of people who are really afraid of being involved and taking the challenge as activists, to be engaged in a lot of political problems, a lot of political conflicts that is going on, like Palestine, Israel, like Ukraine, Russia, like lots of places, just being scared because of the concept of power, because of just being labels of being journalists and activists, being financial and activists, that will ruin their life, and that will make them not like they will be afraid of being activist as an activist. This is one thing. You are what I call you an old young activist. An old young activist is with all this experience. I wish that you can just give some hope. Like I don't like always to talk about the past and what is going on just like now, but what we can do. What as we are as activists, how we can be involved, how these people can just give a hand to others and to other conflict. Thanks.
Again, I think first you have to ask what goal you're trying to achieve. Okay, if the goal you're trying to achieve is the short-term goal of ending this vicious, murderous siege of Gaza, which is a major crime, and ending the occupation of the West Bank, which is criminal, undoubtedly, and there's also the Golan Heights that I mentioned, which no one talks about. But if that's the goal, then I think it's pretty clear what activists ought to be doing. You have to ask yourself, what's the barrier to achieving this goal? Well, the major barrier to achieving this goal is that the U.S. won't permit it to be. Again, there is an international consensus, includes virtually everyone, at least on paper. And it gives an answer to this short-term problem, leaves other problems. What's blocking it? The U.S. refuses to accept it. You here in the Czech Republic can't influence directly U.S. policy, but you can influence it indirectly through European policy. Now, it's true the Czech Republic doesn't have a very loud voice, but it has a voice. It's taken a horrible position on this, I don't have to tell you, but it could change. And the only way that could change is by what activists do. A direct goal for Czech activists should be to get Czech policy to change on this issue from support for violence, criminality, and repression to willingness to support a political settlement, which is right on the table and has been for 35 years. Okay, if you can achieve that, it could have an impact on Europe, which could move in the same direction, partly has, as I mentioned, but could go beyond. In fact, Europe could free itself from U.S. domination. Europe's a powerful area. It's the richest economic area in the world, bigger population than the United States, more advanced in many ways. Just does not have to follow U.S. orders. That's a choice, and it doesn't have to. And activists can change that choice on this issue, on other issues. And I think those are pretty clear goals that can be formulated, and they lead directly to choice of actions. What choice of actions? You know better than I do. What choice of actions could carry a program like this forward under the specific circumstances in which you live? I mean, I wouldn't presume to tell you about how to do that. You already know how to do it. The problem is one of will, not of opportunity.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much.